How is everyone doing out there in economics online land? Welcome to another version of our macroeconomics study videos. This is a rather important video because it introduces students to the beginning of the heart and soul of macroeconomics. So the title of this chapter is Measuring Domestic Output and National Income. If you think of any good business, whether it's a small mom and pop donut shop or a manufacturing facility in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or a global conglomerate that does multi-billion dollars worth of production, all business firms have some type of internal accounting. And the reason they do internal accounting is they want to get some measure of how much are they producing, what type of sales revenues are they generating, what are their costs of producing that goods and services, how much have they grown quarter on quarter or year on year, what are their profit margins, how do they rank against their competitors. You can think of national income accounting, this particular chapter. It's the same idea, except instead of accounting for one business, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics is going to account for the economic activity taking place in the good old US of A. Okay, so chapter objectives. The big one first, how GDP, gross domestic product, is defined and measured. It's relatively important that you understand what we mean by gross domestic product and how we measure GDP if you want to have any understanding of the macroeconomic picture. Then we will take our GDP understanding, our concept of economic output of production, and we will, look at some relationships between GDP and some other important statistics: net domestic product, national income, personal income, and the big one, disposable income. We're going to introduce this idea called a GDP price index and talk about why we have a price index and why that price index is important, what the purpose of it is, what the function of it is. And then we'll talk about the difference between what we call nominal versus real GDP. And finally, there are some limitations to this measure, this statistic, this means of trying to capture the economic activity within the country. It does a good job of statistically reporting what's going on with our economic production within the United States, but there are limitations to any statistic. Okay, so what is GDP? Gross domestic product, right? It's a measure of economic activity. So if you think about the very large companies in the United States, you got some pharmaceutical companies, you got some giant banks, you got a lot of healthcare companies, right? You have a lot of manufacturing facilities like Ford Motor Company and Boeing, right? And then you have your dentists and your car washes. Then you have little tiny businesses that all they do is they provide maybe check cashing services, or maybe they just help you with finding the best possible vacation. So you have travel agents. All of the economic activity in the United States adds to the productive output of the nation. So what we want to do as a country is we want to measure the economic activity that takes place in the United States. And we measure it each quarter, so every 3 months, and report it. We annualize the data. So we measure it, obviously, we sum it up for the year as well. So we're going to measure how much economic production takes place in the United States. Think of the production of every single solitary good and every single solitary service in the United States. That's what we're trying to measure. How many goods and services were produced in the United States. Now, after we have a firm grasp of how much was produced, we're going to do some comparisons. So we're going to compare the number we just calculated. So let's say it's the first quarter of 2017, which just finished. We'll look at that number and say, okay, well, how does our most recent economic activity, our GDP number, how does it compare to recent trends in the recent past? And then how's it compared to historical trends? In other words, is this a really good number? Is it a bad number? Is it an average number? And then after we have this comparison in number 2, this last piece of the puzzle is extremely important. If necessary, make policy changes. Now, it's not written here, but eventually in another part of our study of macroeconomics, we're going to get into what's called fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is the federal government. So the federal government can change the level of taxation and spending in an effort to alter the course of the economy. And monetary policy is our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve. And the nation's central bank can change the level of money made available and therefore influence interest rates, which are extremely important to how much economic activity takes place. So the third piece is extremely important. We just came out of a severe recession in 2008. It probably started in late 2007, maybe mid 2007. So when the economy faltered, it was obvious after we measured the number and we compared it to historical data and recent trends that something had to be done. So this third piece of the puzzle is important. If necessary, make policy changes. All right, so GDP equals P times Q. This chapter is sometimes what I like to refer to as the alphabet soup chapter. There's a lot of these, alphabraic expressions that we use to teach economic ideas and concepts and principles. So, gross domestic product, the amount of economic activity that takes place in the United States, how much output our nation is producing, whether it's small, medium, or large businesses, right? What we're really trying to measure over there is Q. So if you see, it says, goal is to sum up quantity of goods and services produced in the nation, right? We're really trying to measure Q there. But we can't say, all right, well, there were 6,752 air conditioning service calls which took place in the first 2 weeks of January. And there were 1,413 trips to the dry cleaner, right? That wouldn't make any sense. So we need a common denominator. So GDP, we're trying to measure the quantity of goods and services produced, but we need price. We need with the cost of the money there, right? A monetary measure it's going to be. We need the price of all these goods and services as the common denominator, right? So we take the quantity of goods and services and we multiply that by the price of the final value of those goods and services. And that gives us our gross domestic product number. Okay, now let's get into the heart and soul of how do we measure economic activity. So we already talked about the idea of national income accounting, right? We talked about the idea of having this Bureau of Economic Analysis measure how much activity, how much economic production takes place in the nation each year. And we said it's important to measure it, it's important to compare it to recent and historical trends, and then if necessary make policy changes. But what are we, or how are we accurately and efficiently measuring economic production in the United States? So GDP, right? What do we count? What don't we count? And how do we count it? Gross domestic product, the primary idea here is it's a monetary measure, okay? We looked at that equation, GDP equals P times Q. So we're measuring the quantity of goods and services produced, right? We're measuring how many air conditioners and how many trips to the dentist and how many people went and got dry cleaning service and how many cars and trucks and motorcycles were produced in the United States and how many airplanes were produced at Boeing, right? And how many airline trips were made available at that service. But we can't say to the public with any type of organization or intelligence, 100 million trips to the dentist took place in the first quarter of 2017, and this many cars rolled off the lot. We need a way to capture that economic activity. So it's a monetary measure, right? We use the price of these final goods and services to add it all up, to sum it all up. So GDP is a monetary measure. So we take a monetary measure of what then? Okay, of all final goods and services. So let's revisit the idea of the automobile. Let's say that Ford Motor Company produces one of their famous F-150s, the best-selling truck in the United States for a long time now. This is not an ad for Ford. I'm just making an observation. So let's say that the Ford Motor Company produces a truck, that F-150, and it's the final market value of that car when it's sold is $28,500. So we want to add $28,500 towards gross domestic product during the time period it is produced. Now, we don't want to also add in what we call intermediate goods. In other words, we don't want to add in the cost of the tires and the transmission and the engine and the stereo system and the GPS, because that's already in the 28,500 number. So if we added intermediate goods, we'd be guilty of what's called multiple counting. So we say it's a monetary measure of only final goods produced in the United States. Now, of course, goods and services, but when we measure services, we don't have this problem of intermediate goods. So it's a monetary measure of final goods produced in the nation. Now let's look at the next bullet point here. Produced, not necessarily consumed. So sometimes a good is produced in, say, I don't know, November or December, and it's not actually consumed until later. In other words, think about a furniture company making some nice fine furniture, some we'll say really high end upscale dining room furniture. Well, if XYZ furniture company produces let's say $5.25 million worth of furniture in December of 2015, right? We want to put that number, that amount of production, into the 2015 GDP statistic, even if that furniture is not sold until 6 months later when the year has changed over. And we'll show you how we can accurately account for these changes, because national income accounting, we have to have a way to do this. So GDP is a measure of final goods and services produced, not necessarily consumed. Now this next one's an important idea, the idea of domestic production. So it does not matter if the resources used in the production process are domestically owned or internationally owned, whether it's a U.S. company or a foreign company producing the good or service. As long as the production takes place here in the United States, it counts towards U.S. GDP. So we mentioned a Ford Motor Company making a truck, but Toyota makes trucks, right? So a Japanese automobile manufacturer, they have, Toyota has manufacturing plants down south in the Carolinas, and so when Japan, that Japanese, not the country, but the Japanese firm, that corporation, when they produce a truck in the United States, it counts towards U.S. GDP. Now, years ago, we used to use the measure called GNP, gross national product, and this was not the case, but in 1992, the WTA, the World Trade Organization, decided that it would probably be more accurate for all countries to use gross domestic product as a means of summing up production which took place in a country. So domestic production, okay? Now, what's not counted towards the production? We exclude non-production transactions. In the next slide, we're going to go into much more detail in what we mean by non-production transactions. So, non-production transactions, purely financial transactions, are not counted, are not part of GDP, purely financial transactions. So, we call these first round of purely financial transactions, public transfer payments. So when the government sends a Social Security check to a retired individual, we don't want to count that check, that spending, as part of economic production, because no good was produced, no service was provided. Now, of course, this person deserves their Social Security check, but if we added in that amount of government spending, we would be guilty of overstating economic activity. So transfer payments include things such as welfare checks and unemployment benefits and Social Security benefits. So those are transfers from those who are working. That's what we call them transfers. People who are working and paying taxes to people who right now either have earned Social Security because they've been working for several years and now retired, or just are in need of a transfer payments. But we don't want to add transfer payments towards the GDP number. So public transfer payments, as well as private transfer payments. So if I were to say send money to a good friend of mine, well, we don't want to add that towards GDP. It's definitely not an economic production number. It has nothing to do with how much economic activity takes place in the United States. So if your grandmother says, oh, I'm getting up in age in here, and I'm going to send you $20,000. Well, lucky you, that's great, but we don't want to add that $20,000 towards GDP, right? So public transfer payments, private transfer payments, we will call them purely financial transactions. And then anything that which is a purely financial transaction, such as stocks or the bond market transaction. So for instance, let's say that I think that Microsoft Corporation is going to perform well over the next 5 or 10 years, and I'd like to buy some Microsoft shares, some shares of that company. So let's assume Microsoft is selling at $60 a share. So say, I'll buy 100 shares of Microsoft. That's going to cost me $6,000. Well, when I buy those shares, I'm buying them off somebody else who owns the shares. Whether it's another company that owns the shares or another person that owns the shares. But that's purely a financial transaction. No good was produced, no service was provided. Now, obviously, let's say I execute the trade through my E-Trade account, and E-Trade charges me, say, $7 for the trade. That little piece of that of the transaction, that's added towards GDP because that's a service. But purely financial transactions are simply transferring what? The ownership of one financial asset from one individual to another individual. So no good was produced, no new service was provided. And then finally, secondhand sales. So let's say that my grandfather bought a Ford Mustang in 1964, the first year they rolled off the lot, and he had the foresight to put it away up on block and preserve this beautiful automobile. Well, great. It's cool that he paid $1,475 for it brand new in 1964, and then I can now sell it for 90 grand. But it was counted towards GDP in the year it was produced. It was counted in 1964, so secondhand sales are not counted. But if I'm a used car salesperson, right? So if I buy, I don't know, a 2012 Lexus for say $6,000, and I sell it, I'm crafty and I sell it for $7,200, and that's my business. That's what I do. I buy used cars and I resell them with the intention of making a profit. In this case, I bought it for $6,000. I resold it for $7,200. The difference between what I paid for it and what I sold it for, we call that value added. And that piece of the puzzle, that piece of the transaction, that would be counted towards GDP.